And welcome back to Asia First. We want to circle back to the conversation before the break. We were talking about the impact of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Dr. Ian Ralby joins us once more. He's Chief Executive Officer at IR Consilium. Dr. Ralby, so you were telling us about the choke points and why the Strait is a particularly important choke point, and you were talking about the Black Sea as well. If I can get you to sort of elaborate a little bit more.
Yes, so every choke point has, given its geography, different energy and grain and food and economic supplies that run through it. And the problem with the Strait of Hormuz is that it affects all the others because energy supplies are required for even the movement of the ships themselves. And so when we look at what is happening, we are seeing a globalized impact very quickly taking shape. And if this continues for more than a few days and into weeks or months and continues to set oil prices moving higher and higher, everyone on Earth is going to feel this, not just when they go to fill up the tank of a car or to use energy supplies for heating or cooling, but just to go buy food. The food prices, the goods prices, everything is going to increase. And so we have a real challenge now for how to try to mitigate some of those impacts. And the days and weeks ahead are going to be quite challenging on that front.
Okay, so if everyone suffers, I wonder how sustainable this shutdown is for Iran itself, given that it also relies on regional trade and energy flows.
Iran has been under an incredible amount of sanctions and crippling blockades of economic means for years. Since 2019, it has engaged in different behavior in the maritime space to try to push back against that. But it's also innovated tremendously on how to maintain an access to global markets, even amid all those sanctions and blockages. And so it has an ability to adapt to hard pressure from the rest of the world and find resilient means of maintaining some kind of economic access. The rest of the world has not, however, had to deal with this kind of closure of the Strait of Hormuz in many years, at least since the tanker wars, or really ever, because this is a more extreme version than what we've ever seen in the past. So we're facing a crisis that Iran is a bit more well-placed to try to survive, whereas the rest of us are likely to suffer a bit more. And the Iranians have a pretty good motivation for maintaining it as long as possible, given the experience they've had over the last few weeks of losing their entire leadership, having bombing of the capital city and elsewhere, and losing critical aspects of its economy and infrastructure.
Dr. Ralby, what I do not understand is why wasn't something done about this? I mean, from the immediate perspective, the military planners, the consultants, that were looking at this before the U.S. decided to attack would be aware of the Strait and its importance. And this, as you were saying, goes back decades, this particular worry, about the Strait. And the girls were laughing at me, but I ask you only half seriously, why wasn't a UAE-Oman canal, for example, built just to mitigate this potential risk?
I mean, it's not a bad question. And to be honest, many things have been discussed along those lines and canals elsewhere. Fundamentally, though, I don't think many expected Iran to actually go this far, and others didn't expect the U.S. and Israel to go this far. And so assumptions have, I think, crippled the action. Even though the Gulf states have a lot of money, it would also have been an incredibly costly project. So while this may seem feasible, that would have been a very challenging aspect for maritime commerce to be able to flow through a canal manufactured through Oman and UAE. However, I think what you mentioned is really critically important, which is that the military planners seem not to have taken into account the likelihood that Iran would fight back and fight back in the way it has. And unfortunately, we're hearing statements that suggest that the war and all the fighting is almost over because some of the conventional assets have been taken out or crippled, including the mine-laying vessels. The problem is that over the last few years, not just in the Strait of Hormuz, where Iran itself has shown an incredible degree of innovation, but in places like Ukraine and Yemen, where the Houthis have been incredibly successful in waging attacks against maritime commerce, we've seen innovation using low-cost, high impact technology that does not require conventional military assets to either deploy or be effective. And so one of the problems that we have looming is that while we have perhaps taken out some of the mine laying capabilities and other the naval assets of Iran, Iran is far from finished when it comes to its capacity to inflict harm on merchant vessels. And so we have a huge amount of innovation that could potentially continue this problem for a long time, even when military planners themselves wouldn't necessarily understand or see some of the aspects that could be used or marshaled to great effect against commercial vessels.
Okay, so let's talk about the response that the U.S. has floated escorting commercial vessels. I wonder how complex is that mission in such a narrow, high-risk waterway? And does escorting tankers actually reduce risk, or could it raise potential for miscalculation?
Yeah, I think it's really important to note who has been pushing these ideas, because the Navy has not been the one coming out and suggesting this. In fact, the Navy has come out and said, we're not in a place to be able to do that right now. And I think rightly so. While political solutions perhaps suggest that this would be the answer to all problems, you raise the valid point, which is that there are other complications. First of all, a close protection escort mission is incredibly difficult and incredibly dangerous. Navy vessels aren't as maneuverable and quick as small craft, which may be exactly what Iran would use in order to try to attack vessels being protected by that convoy. And while the equipment of the military is extremely complex, sophisticated, and lethal, it unfortunately is not necessarily as quick in responding to some of the newer technologies that are very low cost and could be used in large numbers to overwhelm those very defenses. And so as you see a convoy, it is a giant target. And so with gray hulls and merchant vessels alike flouting the warnings of the Iranian regime, it is very likely that they would do everything they could to embarrass the U.S. and other militaries that might try this, as well as continue to inflict harm on the merchant vessels in order to ensure that their ability to control the Strait of Hormuz remains very clearly visible to the whole world. So it is an incredibly dangerous, difficult, and not in any way guaranteed mission.
Understood, Dr. Welby. I want to ask you the day after question as well. Lots of people believe that the Middle East is going to be remapped completely. So I'm wondering what you see as the possible scenarios as far as maritime risks are concerned, and how that's going to impact not just the region, but also, highly Asia, which is highly dependent on oil from the region.
Well, I think let's start with that last point, because I think it's really important to note. I mentioned before that roughly 38% of the global seaborne trade in crude oil supplies is coming out of that strait. However, about 85% of that is headed for Asia. In other words, the Asian markets have a much, much greater direct impact on the physical supply. Now, the price will be affected everywhere, but the physical supply is reliant on Gulf oil. And so we are likely to see a disproportionately high impact in fuel and oil availability in Asian markets as compared to elsewhere, where the price may be up, but the availability remains consistent. And so this is going to be a challenging balancing act, because we are probably also going to see other aspects of maritime insecurity arise. We have not talked yet about the possibility of the Houthis resurging their maritime attacks in order to support their allies in Iran. And piracy remains a looming concern, that when the watch over that aspect becomes distracted by more pressing matters, including resuming the transits through the Strait of Hormuz, it opens the door for a resurgence in that space. And so maritime commerce is very much under great pressure at the moment. We've already seen it deal with the strategic shock of having to essentially avoid the Red Sea, and in many parts the Suez Canal as well. And so that transfer of cargo directional flows and routes has already put it under extreme strain. It is not in a place to have the agility or the resilience to take on another critical strategic shock, especially as it's twofold. It is both the routes and the movement, along with the concerns about seafarers and everything else in the strait itself, but with it, the increased price of the actual fuel oil that they rely on in order for those ships to be moving around the world. And so we're likely to see a compound issue that is going to make people make new decisions about where to trade, how to trade, where the flow should move, and what to be doing. And so the whole world is likely to see changes in the coming weeks and months.
Understood. Dr. Welby, we do have to leave it there. Fantastic talking to you on the show this morning. That's Ian Welby, Chief Executive Officer at IR Consilium.